CHAPTER X of Mount Royal Volume 2 by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. CHAPTER X. But it sufficeth that the day will end. Christabel said no word to her husband about that unexpected meeting with Angus Hamleigh. She knew that the name was obnoxious to Leonard, and she shrank from a statement which might provoke unpleasant speech on his part. Mr. Hamleigh would doubtless have left Trevena in a few days, there was no likelihood of any further meeting. The next day was a blank day for the Miss Vandeleurs, who found themselves reduced to the joyless society of their own sex. The harriers met at Trevena at 10 o'clock, and thither, after an early breakfast, rode Mr. Tregonell, Captain Vandeleur, and 3 or 4 other kindred spirits. The morning was showery and blustery, and it was in vain that Dopsy and Mopsy hinted their desire to be driven to the meet. They were not horsewomen, from no want of pluck or ardour for the chase, but simply from the lack of that material part of the business, horses. Many and many a weary summer day had they paced the path beside Rotten Row, wistfully regarding the riders, and thinking what a seat and what hands they would have had, if Providence had only given them a mount. The people who do not ride are the keenest critics of horsemanship. Compelled to find their amusements within doors, Dopsy and Mopsy sat in the morning room for half an hour, as a sacrifice to good manners, paid a duty visit to the nurseries to admire Christabel's baby boy, and then straggled off to the billiard room to play each other, and improve their skill at that delightfully masculine game. Then came luncheon; at which meal, the gentlemen being all away, and the party reduced to 4, the baby boy was allowed to sit on his mother's lap, and make occasional raids upon the table furniture, while the Miss Vandeleurs made believe to worship him. He was a lovely boy, with big blue eyes, wide with wonder at a world which was still full of delight and novelty. After luncheon, Mopsy and Dopsy retired to their chamber, to concoct, by an ingenious process of reorganization of the same atoms, a new costume for the evening; and as they sat at their work, twisting and undoing bows and lace, and straightening the leaves of artificial flowers, they again discoursed somewhat dejectedly of their return to South Belgravia, which could hardly be staved off much longer. " We have had quite too delicious time," sighed Mopsy, adjusting the stalk of a sunflower; "but it's rather a pity that all the men staying here have been detrimentals, not one worth catching." " What does it matter ?" ejaculated Dopsy. " If there had been one worth catching, he wouldn't have consented to be caught. He would have behaved like that big Jack Mr. Tregonell was trying for the other morning — eaten up all our bait and gone and sulked among the weeds." " Well, I'd have had a try for him anyhow," said Mopsy defiantly, leaning her elbow on the dressing table, and contemplating herself deliberately in the glass. " Oh, Dop, how old I'm getting. I almost hate the daylight. It makes one look so hideous." Yet neither Dopsy nor Mopsy thought herself hideous at afternoon tea time, when, with complexions improved by the powder puff, eyebrows piquantly accentuated with Indian ink, and loose flowing tea gowns of old gold sateen and older black silk, they descended to the library, eager to do execution even on detrimentals. The men's voices sounded loud in the hall, as the two girls came downstairs. " Hope you have had a good time," cried Mopsy, in cheerful soprano tones. " Splendid. I'm afraid Tregonell has lamed a couple of his horses," said Captain Vandeleur. " And I've a shrewd suspicion that you've lamed a third," interjected Leonard, in his strident tones. " You galloped Betsy Baker at a murderous rate." " Nothing like taking them fast downhill," retorted Jack. " B. is as sound as a roach, and quite as ugly." " Never saw such a breakneck work in my life," said Mr. Montagu, a small dandified person who was always called Little Monty. " I'd rather ride a horse with the Quorn for a week than this country for a day." " Our country is as God made it," answered Leonard. " I think Sutton must have split it about a bit afterwards," said Mr. Montagu. " Well, Mop," asked Leonard, " how did you and Dop get rid of your day without us ?"" Oh, we were very happy. It was quite a relief to have a nice homey day with dear Mrs. Tregonell," answered Mopsy, nothing offended by the free and easy curtailment of her pet name. Leonard was her benefactor and a privileged person. " I've got some glorious news for you two girls," said Mr. Tregonell, as they all swarmed into the library, where Christabel was sitting in the widow's old place, while Jessie Bridgeman filled her accustomed position before the tea table, the red glow of a liberal wood fire contending with the pale light of one low moderator lamp under a dark velvet shade. " What is it ? Please tell." I'll give it you in 10, 1,000, a million," cried Leonard, flinging himself into the chair next his wife, and with his eyes upon her face. " You'll never guess. I have found you an eligible bachelor — a swell of the first water. He's a gentleman whom a good many girls have tried for in their time, I've no doubt. Handsome, accomplished, plenty of coin. He has what the French call a stormy youth, I believe — but that doesn't matter. He's getting on in years, and no doubt he's ready to sober down and take to domesticity. I've asked him here for a fortnight to shoot woodcock, and to offer his own unconscious breast as a mark for the arrows of Cupid — and I shall have a very poor opinion of you two girls if you can't bring him to your feet in half the time." " At any rate I'll try my hand at it," said Mopsy. " Not that I care a straw for the gentleman, but just to show you what I can do," she added, by way of maintaining her maidenly dignity. " Of course you'll go in for the conquest as high art without any arriere pensee," said Jack Vandeleur. " There never were such audacious flirts as my sisters — but there's no malice in them." " You haven't told us your friend's name," said Dopsy. " Mr. Hamleigh," answered Leonard, with his eyes still on his wife's face. Christabel gave a little start, and looked at him in undisguised astonishment. " Surely you have not asked him — here ?" she exclaimed. " Why not ? He was out with us to day. He is a jolly fellow — rides uncommonly straight, though he doesn't look as if there were much life in him. He tailed off early in the afternoon — but while he did go he went deuced well — he rode a deuced fine horse too." " I thought you were prejudiced against him," said Christabel, very slowly. " Why, so I was, till I saw him," answered Leonard, with the friendliest air. " I fancied he was one of your sickly sentimental twaddlers, with long hair and a taste for poetry ; but I find he is a fine manly fellow, with no nonsense about him. So I asked him here, and insisted upon his saying yes. He didn't seem to want to come — which is odd, for he made himself very much at home here in my mother's time, I've heard. However, he gave in when I pressed him, and he'll be here by dinner time to morrow." " By dinner time," thought Mopsy, delighted. " Then he'll see us first by candlelight, and first impressions may do so much." " Isn't it almost like a fairy tale ?" said Dopsy, as they were dressing for dinner, with a vague recollection of having cultivated her imagination in childhood. She had never done so since that juvenile age. " Just as we were sighing for the prince, he comes." " True," said Mopsy, " and he will go, just as all the other fairy princes have gone, leaving us alone upon the dreary high road, and riding off to the fairy princesses who have good homes, and good clothes, and plenty of money." The high art toilettes were postponed for the following evening, so that the panoply of woman's war might be fresh ; and on that evening Mopsy and Dopsy, their long limbs sheathed in sea green velveteen, Toby frills round their necks, and sunflowers on their shoulders, were gracefully grouped near the fireplace in the pink and white panelled drawing room, waiting for Mr. Hamleigh's arrival. " I wonder why all the girls make themselves walking advertisements of the Sun Fire Office," speculated Mr. Montagu, taking a prosaic view of the Vandeleur sunflowers, as he sat by Miss Bridgeman's work basket. " Don't you know that sunflowers are so beautifully Greek ?" asked Jessie. " They have been the only flower in fashion since Alma Tadema took to painting them — fountains and marble balustrades, and Italian skies, and beautiful women, and sunflowers." " Yes, but we get only the sunflowers." " Mr. Hamleigh," said the butler at the open door, and Angus came in, and went straight to Christabel, who was sitting opposite the group of sea green Vandeleurs, slowly fanning herself with a big black fan. Nothing could be calmer than their meeting. This time there was no surprise, no sudden shock, no dear familiar scene, no solemn grandeur of nature to make all effort at simulation unnatural. The atmosphere to night was as conventional as the men's swallowed tail coats and white ties. Yet in Angus Hamleigh's mind there was the picture of his first arrival at Mount Royal — the firelit room, Christabel's girlish figure kneeling on the hearth. The figure was a shade more matronly now, the carriage and manner were more dignified ; but the face had lost none of its beauty, or of its divine candour. " I am very glad my husband persuaded you to alter your plans and to stay a little longer in the West," she said with unfaltering voice ; and then, seeing Mopsy and Dopsy looking at Mr. Hamleigh with admiring expectant eyes, she added, " Let me introduce you to these young ladies who are staying with us. Mr. Hamleigh, Miss Vandeleur, Miss Margaret Vandeleur." Dopsy and Mopsy smiled their sweetest smiles, and gave just the most aesthetic inclination of each towzled head. " I suppose you have not long come from London," murmured Dopsy, determined not to lose a moment. " Have you seen all the new things at the theatres ? I hope you are an Irvingite." " I regret to say that my religious opinions have not yet taken that bent. It is a spiritual height which I feel myself too weak to climb. I have never been able to believe in the unknown tongues." " Ah, now you are going to criticise his pronunciation instead of admiring his genius," said Dopsy, who had never heard of Edward Irving and the Latter Day Saints. " If you mean Henry Irving, the tragedian, I admire him immensely," said Mr. Hamleigh. " Then we are sure to get on. I felt that you must be simpatica," replied Dopsy, not particular as to gender in a language which she only knew by sight, as Bannister knew Greek. Dinner was announced at this moment, and Mrs. Tregonell won Dopsy's gratitude by asking Mr. Hamleigh to take her in to dinner. Mr. Montagu gave his arm to Miss Bridgeman, Leonard took Mopsy, and Christabel followed with Major Bree, who felt for her keenly, wondering how she managed to bear herself so bravely, reproaching the dead woman in his mind for having parted two faithful hearts. He was shocked by the change in Angus, obvious even to night, albeit the soft lamplight and evening dress were flattering to his appearance ; but he said no word of that change to Christabel. " I have been having a romp with my godson," he said, when they were seated, knowing that this was the one topic likely to cheer and interest his hostess. " I am so glad," she answered, lighting up at once, and unconscious that Angus was trying to see her face under the low lamplight, which made it necessary to bend one's head a little to see one's opposite neighbour. " And do you think he is grown ? It is nearly 10 days since you saw him, and he grows so fast." " He is a young Hercules. If there were any snakes in Cornwall he would be capable of strangling a brace of them. I suppose Leonard is tremendously proud of him." " Yes," she answered with a faint sigh, " I think Leonard is proud of him." " But not quite so fond of him as you are," replied Major Bree, interpreting her emphasis. " That is only natural. Infantolatry is a feminine attribute. Wait till the boy is old enough to go out fishin' and shootin'" — the Major was too much a gentleman to pronounce a final G —" and then see if his father don't dote upon him." " I daresay he will be very fond of him then. But I shall be miserable every hour he is out." " Of course. Women ought to have only girls for children. There should be a race of man mothers to rear the boys. I wonder Plato didn't suggest that in his Republic." Mr. Hamleigh, with his head gently bent over his soup plate, had contrived to watch Christabel's face while politely replying to a good deal of gush on the part of the fair Dopsy. He saw that expressive face light up with smiles, and then grow earnest. She was full of interest and animation, and her candid look showed that the conversation was one which all the world might have heard. " She has forgotten me. She is happy in her married life," he said to himself, and then he looked to the other end of the table where Leonard sat, burly, florid, black haired, mutton chop whiskered, the very essence of Philistinism, happy — with him. " And I am sure you must adore Ellen Terry," said Dopsy, whose society conversation was not a many stringed instrument. " Who could live and not worship her ?" ejaculated Mr. Hamleigh. " Irving as Shylock," sighed Dopsy. " Miss Terry as Portia," retorted Angus. " Unutterably sweet, was she not ? Her movements were like a sonata by Beethoven, her gowns were the essence of all that Rubens and Vandyke ever painted." " I knew you would agree with me," exclaimed Dopsy. " And do you think her pretty ?"" Pretty is not the word. She is simply divine. Greuze might have painted her. There is no living painter whose palette holds the tint of those blue eyes." Dopsy began to giggle softly to herself, and to flutter her fan with maiden modesty. " I hardly like to mention it after what you have said," she murmured, " but "" Pray be explicit." " I have been told that I am rather "— another faint giggle and another flutter —" like Miss Terry." " I never met a fair haired girl yet who had not been told as much," answered Mr. Hamleigh coolly. Dopsy turned crimson, and felt that this particular arrow had missed the gold. Mr. Hamleigh was not quite so easy to get on with as her hopeful fancy had painted him. After dinner there was some music, in which art neither of the Miss Vandeleurs excelled. Indeed, their time had been too closely absorbed by the ever pressing necessity for cutting and contriving to allow of the study of art and literature. They knew the names of writers, and the outsides of books, and they adored the opera, and enjoyed a ballad concert, if the singers were popular and the audience well dressed; and this was the limit of their artistic proclivities. They sat stifling their yawns, and longing for an adjournment to the billiard room, whither Jack Vandeleur and Mr. Montagu had departed, while Christabel played a capriccio by Mendelssohn. Mr. Hamleigh sat by the piano listening to every note. Leonard and Major Bree lounged by the fireplace, Jessie Bridgeman sitting near them, absorbed in her crewel work. It was what Mopsy and Dopsy called a very " slow " evening, despite the new interest afforded by Mr. Hamleigh's presence. He was very handsome, very elegant, with an inexpressible something in his style and air which Mopsy thought poetical ; but it was weary work to sit and gaze at him as if he were a statue, and that long capriccio, with a little Beethoven to follow, and a good deal of Mozart after that, occupied the best part of the evening. To the ears of Mop and Dop it was all Tweedledum and Tweedledee. They would have been refreshed by one of those lively melodies in which Miss Farren so excels. They would have welcomed a familiar strain from Chilperic or Madame Angot. Yet they gushed, and said, " Too delicious, quite too utterly lovely," when Mrs. Tregonell rose from the piano. " I only hope I have not wearied everybody," she said. Leonard and Major Bree had been talking local politics all the time, and both expressed themselves much gratified by the music. Mr. Hamleigh murmured his thanks. Christabel went to her room wondering that the evening had passed so calmly — that her heart, though it had ached at the change in Angus Hamleigh's looks, had been in no wise tumultuously stirred by his presence. There had been a peaceful feeling in her mind rather than agitation. She had been soothed and made happy by his society. If love still lingered in her breast it was love purified of every earthly thought and hope. She told herself sorrowfully that for him the sand ran low in the glass of earthly time, and it was sweet to have him near her for a little while towards the end — to be able to talk to him of serious things — to inspire hope in a soul whose natural bent was despondency. It would be sadly, unutterably sweet to talk to him of that spiritual world whose unearthly light already shone in the too brilliant eye, and coloured the hollow cheek. She had found Mr. Hamleigh despondent and sceptical, but never indifferent to religion. He was not one of that eminently practical school which, in the words of Matthew Arnold, thinks it's more important to learn how buttons and papier mache are made than to search the depths of conscience, or fathom the mysteries of a divine providence. Christabel's first sentiment when Leonard announced Mr. Hamleigh's intended visit had been horror. How could they two, who had loved so deeply, parted so sadly, live together under the same roof as if they were everyday friends ? The thing seemed fraught with danger, impossible for peace. But when she remembered that calm, almost solemn look with which he had shaken hands with her among the graves of Tintagel, it seemed to her that friendship — calmest, purest, most unselfish attachment — was still possible between them. She thought so even more hopefully on the morning after Mr. Hamleigh's arrival, when he took her boy in his arms, and pressed his lips lovingly upon the bright baby brow. " You are fond of children," exclaimed Mopsy, prepared to gush. " Very fond of some children," he answered gravely. " I shall be very fond of this boy, if he will let me." " Leo is such a darling, and he takes to you already," said Mopsy, seeing that the child graciously accepted Mr. Hamleigh's attentions, and even murmured an approving " Grrr," followed by a simple one-part melody of gurgling noises — but whether in approval of the gentleman himself, or of his watch chain, about which the pink flexible fingers had wound themselves, was an open question. This was in the hall after breakfast, on a bright sunshiny morning — doors and windows open, and the gardens outside all abloom with chrysanthemums and scarlet geraniums — the gentlemen of the party standing about with their guns ready to start. Mopsy and Dopsy were dressed in home made gowns of dark brown serge, which simulated the masculine simplicity of tailor made garments. They wore coquettish little toques of the same dark brown stuff, also home made ; and surely, if a virtuous man contending with calamity is a spectacle meet for the gods to admire, a needy young woman making her own raiment is at least worthy of human approval. " You are coming with us, aren't you, Hamleigh ?" asked Leonard, seeing Angus still occupied with the child. "No, thanks. I don't feel in good form for woodcock shooting. My cough was rather troublesome last night." Mopsy and Dopsy looked at each other despairingly. Here was a golden opportunity lost. If it were only possible to sprain an ankle on the instant. Jack Vandeleur was a good brother, so long as fraternal kindness did not cost money, and he saw that look of blank despair in poor Dopsy's eyes and lips. " I think Mr. Hamleigh is wise," he said. " This bright morning will end in broken weather. Hadn't you two girls better stay at home ? The rain will spoil your gowns." " Our gowns won't hurt," said Mopsy, brightening. " But do you really think there will be rain ? We had so set our hearts on going with you. But it is rather miserable to be out on those hills in a blinding rain. One might walk over the edge of a cliff." " Keep on the safe side, and stay at home," said Leonard, with that air of rough good nature which is such an excellent excuse for bad manners. " Come, Ponto, come, Juno. Hi, Delia," this to the lovely lemon and white spaniels, fawning upon him with mute affection. " I think we may as well give it up," said Dopsy. " We shall be a nuisance to the shooters if it rains." So they stayed, and beguiled Mr. Hamleigh to the billiard room, where they both played against him, and were beaten, after which Mopsy entreated him to give her a lesson in the art, declaring that he played divinely, in such a quite style, so very superior to Jack's or Mr. TregonelFs, though both those gentlemen were good players. Angus consented kindly enough, and gave both ladies the most careful instruction in the art of making pockets and cannons. But he was wondering all the while how Christabel was spending her morning, and thinking how sweet it would have been to have strolled with her across the hills to the quiet little church in the dingle where he had once dreamed they two might be married. " I was a fool to submit to delay," he thought, remembering all the pain and madness of the past. " If I had insisted on being married here — and at once — how happy, God, how happy we might have been. Well, it matters little, now that the road is so near the end. I suppose the dismal close would have come just as soon if my way of life had been strewed with flowers." It was luncheon time before the Miss Vandeleurs consented to release him. Once having got him in their clutch, he was as firmly held as if he had been caught by an octopus. Christabel wondered a little that Angus Hamleigh should find amusement for his morning in the billiard room and in such society. " Perhaps, after all, the Miss Vandeleurs are the kind of girls whom all gentlemen admire," she said to Jessie. " I know I thought it odd that Leonard should admire them, but you see Mr. Hamleigh is equally pleased with them." " Mr. Hamleigh is nothing of the kind," answered Jessie in her usual decided way ;" but Dop is setting her cap at him in a positively disgraceful manner, even for Dop." " Pray don't call her by that horrid name." " Why not ? It is what her brother and sister call her, and it expresses her so exactly." Mr. Hamleigh and the two damsels now appeared, summoned by the gong, and they all went into the dining room. It was quite a merry luncheon party. Care seemed to have no part in that cheery circle. Angus had made up his mind to be happy, and Christabel was as much at ease with him as she had been in those innocent, unconscious days when he first came to Mount Royal. Dopsy was in high spirits, thinking that she was fast advancing towards victory. Mr. Hamleigh had been so kind, so attentive, had done exactly what she had asked him to do, and how could she doubt that he had consulted his own pleasure in so doing ? Poor Dopsy was accustomed to be treated with scant ceremony by her brother's acquaintance, and it did not enter into her mind that a man might be bored by her society and not betray his weariness. After luncheon Jessie, who was always energetic, suggested a walk. The threatened bad weather had not come — it was a greyish afternoon, sunless, but mild. " If we walk towards St. Nectan^s Kieve we may meet the shooters," said Christabel. " That is a great place for woodcock." " That will be delicious," exclaimed Dopsy. " I worship St. Nectan^s Kieve. Such a lovely, ferny, rocky, wild, watery spot." And away she and her sister skipped, to put on the brown toques, and to refresh themselves with a powder puff. They started for their ramble with Randie, and a favourite Clumber spaniel, degraded from his proud position as a sporting dog to the ignoble luxury of a house pet, on account of an incorrigible desultoriness in his conduct with birds. These affectionate creatures frisked round Christabel, while Miss Vandeleur and her sister seemed almost as friskily to surround Mr. Hamleigh with their South Belgravian blandishments. " You look as if you were not very strong," hazarded Dopsy sympathetically. " Are you not afraid of a long walk ?"" Not at all. "I never feel better than when walking on these hills," answered Angus. "It is almost my native air, you see. I came here to get a stock of rude health before I go to winter in the South." "And you are really going to be abroad all the winter?" sighed Dopsy, as if she would have said, " How shall I bear my life in your absence ?" "Yes, it is 5 years since I spent a winter in England. I hold my life on that condition. I am never to know the luxury of a London fog, or see a Drury Lane pantomime, or skate upon the Serpentine. A case of real distress, is it not ?"" Very sad — for your friends," said Dopsy. " But I can quite imagine that you love the sunny South. How I long to see the Mediterranean, the mountains, the pine trees, the borderland of Italy." " No doubt you will go there some day — and be disappointed. People generally are when they indulge in day dreams about a place." "My dreams will always be dreams," answered Dopsy, with a profound sigh. " We are not rich enough to travel." Christabel walked on in front with Jessie and the dogs. Mr. Hamleigh was longing to be by her side, to talk as they had talked of old — of 1,000 things which could be safely discussed without any personal feeling. They had so many sympathies, so many ideas in common. All the world of sense and sentiment was theirs wherein to range at will. But Dopsy and Mopsy stuck to him like burrs — plying him with idle questions, and stereotyped remarks, looking at him with languishing eyes. He was too much a gentleman, had too much good feeling to be rude to them, but he was bored excessively. They went by the cliffs — a wild grand walk. The wide Atlantic spread its dull leaden coloured waves before them under the grey sky, touched with none of those translucent azures and carmines which so often beautify that western sea. They crossed a bit of hillocky common, and then went down to look at a slate quarry under the cliff — a scene of uncanny grandeur, grey and wild and desolate. Dopsy and Mopsy gushed and laughed, and declared it was just the scene for a murder, or a duel, or something dreadful and dramatic. The dogs ran into all manner of perilous places, and had to be called away from the verge of instant death. " Are you fond of aristocratic society, Miss Vandeleur ?" asked Angus. Mopsy pleaded guilty to a prejudice in favour of the upper ten. " Then allow me to tell you that you were never in the company of so many duchesses and countesses in your life as you are at this moment." Mopsy looked mystified, until Miss Bridgeman explained that these were the names given to the slates of particular sizes, great stacks of which stood on either side of them ready for shipment. " How absurd !" exclaimed Mopsy. " Everything must have a name, even the slate that roofs your scullery." From the quarry they strolled across the fields to the high road, and the gate of the farm which contains within its boundary the wonderful waterfall called St. Nectan^s Kieve. They met the sportsmen coming out of the hollow with well filled game bags. Leonard was in high spirits. " So you've all come to meet us," he said, looking at his wife, and from his wife to Angus Hamleigh with a keen quick glance, too swift to be remarkable. " Uncommonly good of you. We are going to have a grand year for woodcock, I believe — like the season of 1855, when a farmer at St. Buryan shot 54 in one week." " Poor dear little birds," sighed Mopsy. " I feel sorry for them." " But that doesn't prevent your eating them, with breadcrumbs and gravy," said Leonard, laughing. " When they are once roasted it can make no difference who eats them," replied Mopsy ;" but I am intensely sorry for them all the same." They all went home together — a cheery procession, with the dogs at their heels. Mr. Hamleigh's efforts to escape from the two damsels who had marked him for their own were futile. Nothing less than sheer brutality would have set him free. They trudged along gaily, one on each side of him. They flattered him, they made much of him — a man must have been stony hearted to remain untouched by such attentions. Angus was marble, but he could not be uncivil. It was his nature to be gentle to women. Mop and Dop were the kind of girls he most detested — indeed, it seemed to him that no other form of girlhood could be so detestable. They had all the pertness of Bohemia without any of its wit — they had all the audacity of the demi monde with far inferior attractions. Everything about them was spurious and second hand — every air and look and tone was put on, like a ribbon or a flower, to attract attention. And could it be that one of these meretricious creatures was angling for him — for him, the Lauzun, the Decmule, the Prince de Belgioso of his day — The born dandy, with whom fastidiousness was a sixth sense? Intolerable as the idea of being so pursued was to him, Angus Hamleigh could not bring himself to be rude to a woman. It happened, therefore, that from the beginning to the end of that long ramble he was never in Mrs. TregonelFs society. She and Jessie walked steadily ahead with their dogs, while the sportsman trampled slowly behind Mr. Hamleigh and the two girls. " Our friend seems to be very much taken by your sisters," said Leonard to Captain Vandeleur. " My sisters are deuced taking girls," answered Jack, puffing at his 17th cigarette, " though I suppose it isn't my business to say so. There's nothing of the professional beauty about either of 'em." " Distinctly not," said Leonard. " But they've plenty of chic, plenty of go, savoir faire, and all that kind of thing, don't you know. They're the most companionable girls I ever met with." " They're uncommonly jolly little buffers," said Leonard kindly, meaning it for the highest praise. " They've no fool's flesh about 'em," said Jack, " and they can make a fiver go further than any one I know. A man might do worse than marry one of them." " Hardly," thought Leonard, " unless he married both." " It would be a fine thing for Dop if Mr. Hamleigh were to come to the scratch," mused Jack. " I wonder what was Leonard's motive in asking Mr. Hamleigh to stay at Mount Royal," said Christabel suddenly, after she and Jessie had been talking of indifferent subjects. " I hope he had not any motive, but that the invitation was the impulse of the moment, without rhyme or reason," answered Miss Bridgeman. " Why ?"" Because if he had a motive I don't think it could be a good one." " Might he not think it just possible that he was finding a husband for one of his friend's sisters ?" speculated Isabel. " Nonsense, my dear. Leonard is not quite a fool. If he had a motive, it was something very different from any concern for the interests of Dop or Mop. I will call them Dop and Mop, they are so like it." In spite of Mopsy and Dopsy, there were hours in which Angus Hamleigh was able to enjoy the society which had once been so sweet to him, almost as freely as in the happy days that were gone. Brazen as the two damsels were, the feeling of self respect was not altogether extinct in their natures. Their minds were like grass plots which had been trodden into mere clay, but where a lingering green blade here and there shows that the soil had once been verdant. Before Mr. Hamleigh came to Mount Royal, it had been their habit to spend their evenings in the billiard room with the gentlemen, albeit Mrs. Tregonell very rarely left the drawing room after dinner, preferring the perfect tranquillity of the almost deserted apartment, the inexhaustible delight of her piano or her books, with Jessie for her sole companion ; nay, sometimes quite alone, while Jessie joined the revellers at pool or shell out. Dopsy and Mopsy could not altogether alter their habits because Mr. Hamleigh spent his evenings in the drawing room. The motive for such a change would have been too obvious. The boldest huntress would scarce thus openly pursue her prey. So the Miss Vandeleurs went regretfully with their brother and his host, and marked or played an occasional 4 game, and made themselves conversationally agreeable all the evening ; while Angus Hamleigh sat by the piano and gave himself up to dreamy thought, soothed by the music of the great composers, played with a level perfection which only years of careful study can achieve. Jessie Bridgeman never left the drawing room now of an evening. Faithful and devoted to her duty of companion and friend, she seemed almost Christabel's second self. There was no restraint, no embarrassment caused by her presence. What she had been to these two in their day of joy, she was to them in their day of sorrow, wholly and completely one of themselves. She was no stony guardian of the proprieties — no bar between their souls and dangerous memories or illusions. She was their friend, reading and understanding the minds of both. It had been finely said by Matthew Arnold that there are times when a man feels, in this life, the sense of immortality ; and that feeling must surely be strongest with him who knows that his race is nearly run, who feels the rosy light of life's sunset warm upon his face, who knows himself near the lifting of the veil, the awful, fateful experiment called Death. Angus Hamleigh knew that for him the end was not far off. It might be less than a year — more than a year — but he felt very sure that this time there would be no reprieve. Not again would the physician's sentence be reversed — the physician's theories gainsayed by facts. For the last 4 years he had lived as a man lives who has ceased to value his life. He had exposed himself to the hardships of mountain climbing — he had sat late in gaming saloons, not gambling himself, but interested in a cynical way, as Balzac might have been in the hopes and fears of others, seeking amusement wherever and however it was to be found. At his worst he had never been a man utterly without religion; not a man who could willingly forego the hope in a future life, but that hope, until of late, had been clouded and dim, Rabelais' great, perhaps, rather than the Christian's assured belief. As the cold shade of death drew nearer, the horizon cleared, and he was able to rest his hopes in a fair future beyond the grave, an existence in which a man's happiness should not be dependent on the condition of his lungs, nor his career marred by an hereditary taint in the blood, an existence in which spirits should be divorced from clay, yet not become so entirely abstract as to be incapable of such pleasures as are sweetest and purest among the joys of humanity, a life in which friendship and love might still be known in fullest measure. And now, with the knowledge that for him there remained but a brief remnant of this early existence, that were the circumstances of his life ever so full of joy, that life itself could not be lengthened, it was very sweet to him to spend a few quiet hours with her who, for the last 5 years, had been the pole star of his thoughts. For him there could be no arrière pensée, no tending towards forbidden hopes, forbidden dreams. Death had purified life. It was almost as if he were an immortal spirit, already belonging to another world, yet permitted to revisit the old dead and gone love below. For such a man, and perhaps for such a man only, was such a super-mundane love as poets and idealists have imagined, all satisfying and all sweet. He was not even jealous of his happier rival. His only regret was the too evident unworthiness of that rival. If I had seen her married to a man I could respect, if I could know that she was completely happy, that the life before her were secure from all pain and evil, I should have nothing to regret, he told himself; but the thought of Leonard's coarse nature was a perpetual grief. When I am lying in the long peaceful sleep, she will be miserable with that man, he thought. One day, when Jessie and he were alone together, he spoke freely of Leonard. "I don't want to malign a man who has treated me with exceptional kindness and cordiality," he said, "above all a man whose mother I once loved, and always respected. Yes, although she was hard and cruel to me, but I cannot help wishing that Christabel's husband had a more sympathetic nature. Now that my own future is reduced to a very short span, I find myself given to forecasting the future of those I love, and it grieves me to think of Christabel in the years to come, linked with a man who has no power to appreciate or understand her, tied to the mill wheel of domestic duty." "Yes, it is a hard case," answered Jessie, bitterly. "One of those hard cases that so often come out of people acting for the best, as they call it. No doubt Mrs. Tregonell thought she acted for the best with regard to you and Christabel. She did not know how much selfishness, a selfish idolatry of her own cub, was at the bottom of her over righteousness. She was a good woman, generous, benevolent, a true friend to me, yet there are times when I feel angry with her, even in her grave, for her treatment of you and Christabel. Yet she died happy in the belief in her own wisdom. She thought Christabel's marriage with Leonard ought to mean bliss for both. Because she adored her Cornish gladiator, forsooth, she must needs think everybody else ought to dote upon him." "You don't seem warmly attached to Mr. Tregonell," said Angus. "I am not, and he knows that I am not. I never liked him, and he never liked me, and neither of us ever pretended to like each other. We are quits, I assure you. Perhaps you think it rather horrid of me to live in a man's house, eat his bread and drink his wine, one glass of claret every day at dinner, and dislike him openly all the time. But I am here because Christabel is here, just as I would be with her in the dominions of Orcus. She is — well — almost the only creature I love in this world, and it would take a good deal more than my dislike of her husband to part us. If she had married a galley slave I would have taken my turn at the oar." "You are as true as steel," said Angus, "and I am glad to think Christabel has such a friend." To all the rest of the world he spoke of her as Mrs. Tregonell, nor did he ever address her by any other name. But to Jessie Bridgeman, who had been with them in the halcyon days of their love making, she was still Christabel. To Jessie, and to none other, could he speak of her with perfect freedom. CHAPter 11. Chapter 11 of Mount Royal Volume 2 by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 11. Who knows not Circe? The autumn days crept by, sometimes grey and sad of aspect, sometimes radiant and sunny, as if summer had risen from her grave amidst fallen leaves and faded heather. It was altogether a lovely autumn, like that beauteous season of 5 years ago, and Christabel and Angus wandered about the hills and lingered by the trout stream in the warm green valley, almost as freely as they had done in the past. They were never alone. Jessie Bridgeman was always with them, very often Dopsy and Mopsy, and sometimes Mr. Tregonell with Captain Vandeleur and half a dozen dogs. One day they all went up the hill and crossed the ploughed field to the path among the gorse and heather above Pentargon Bay; and Dopsy and Mopsy climbed crags and knolls and screamed affrightedly, and made a large display of boots, and were generally fascinating after their manner. "If any place could tempt me to smoke it would be this," said Dopsy, gazing seaward. All the men except Angus were smoking. "I think it must be utterly lovely to sit dreaming over a cigarette in such a place as this." "What would you dream about?" asked Angus. "A new bonnet?" "Don't be cynical. You think I am awfully shallow because I am not a perambulating bookshelf like Mrs. Tregonell, who seems to have read all the books that ever were printed." "There you are wrong. She has read a few — non multa sed multum — but they are the very best, and she has read them well enough to remember them," answered Angus quietly. "And Mop and I often read 3 volumes in a day, and seldom remember a line of what we've read," sighed Dopsy. "Indeed, we are awfully ignorant. Of course we learn things at school — French and German, Italian, natural history, physical geography, geology, and all the onomies. Indeed, I shudder when I remember what a lot of learning was poured into our poor little heads, and how soon it all ran out again." Dopsy gave her most fascinating giggle, and sat in an aesthetic attitude, idly plucking up faded heather blossoms with a tightly gloved hand, and wondering whether Mr. Hamleigh noticed how small the hand was. She thought she was going straight to his heart with these naive confessions. She had always heard that men hated learned women, and no doubt Mr. Hamleigh's habit of prosing about books which Mrs. Tregonell was merely the homage he paid to his hostess. "You and Mrs. Tregonell are so dreadfully grave when you get together," pursued Dopsy, seeing that her companion held his peace. She had contrived to be by Mr. Hamleigh's side when he crossed the field, and had in a manner got possessed of him for the rest of the afternoon, barring some violent struggle for emancipation on his part. "I always wonder what you can find to say to each other." "I don't think there is much cause for wonder. We have many tastes in common. We are both fond of music, of nature, and of books. There is a wide field for conversation." "Why won't you talk with me of books? There are some books I adore. Let us talk about Dickens." "With all my heart. I admire every line he wrote. I think him the greatest genius of this age. We have had great writers, great thinkers, great masters of style, but Scott and Dickens were the creators. They made new worlds and peopled them. I am quite ready to talk about Dickens." "I don't think I could say a single word after that outburst of yours," said Dopsy. "You go too fast for me." He had talked eagerly, willing to talk just now even to Miss Vandeleur, trying not too vividly to remember that other day, that unforgotten hour, in which, on this spot, face to face with that ever changing, ever changeless sea, he had submitted his fate to Christabel, not daring to ask for her love, warning her rather against the misery that might come to her from loving him. And misery had come, but not as he presaged. It had come from his youthful sin, that one fatal turn upon the road of life which he had taken so lightly, tripping with joyous companions along a path strewn with roses. He, like so many, had gathered his roses while he might, and had found that he had to bear the sting of their thorns when he must. Leonard came up behind them as they talked, Mr. Hamleigh standing by Miss Vandeleur's side, digging his stick into the heather and staring idly at the sea. "What are you two talking about so earnestly?" he asked. "You are always together. I begin to understand why Hamleigh is so indifferent to sport." The remark struck Angus as strange as well as underbred. Dopsy had contrived to inflict a good deal of her society upon him at odd times ; but he had taken particular care that nothing in his bearing or discourse should compromise either himself or the young lady. Dipsy giggled faintly, and looked modestly at the heather. It was still early in the afternoon, and the western light shone full upon a face which might have been pretty, if nature's bloom had not long given place to the poetic pallor of the powder puff. " We were talking about Dickens," said Dopsy, with an elaborate air of struggling with the tumult of her feelings. " Don't you adore him ?"" If you mean the man who wrote books, I never read 'em," answered Leonard. " Life isn't long enough for books that don't teach you anything. I've read pretty nearly every book that was ever written upon horses and dogs and guns, and a good many on mechanics. That's enough for me. I don't care for books that only titillate one's imagination. Why should one read books to make oneself cry and to make oneself laugh ? It's as idiotic a habit as taking snuff to make oneself sneeze." " That's rather a severe way of looking at the subject," said Angus. " It's a practical way, that's all. My wife surfeits herself with poetry. She is stuffed with Tennyson and Browning, loaded to the very muzzle with Byron and Shelley. She reads Shakespeare as devoutly as she reads her Bible. But I don't see that it helps to make her pleasant company for her husband or her friends. She is never so happy as when she has her nose in a book. Give her a bundle of books and a candle, and she would be happy in the little house on the top of Willapark." " Not without you and her boy," said Dopsy, gushingly. " She could never exist without you two." Mr. Tregonell lit himself another cigar, and strolled off without a word. " He has not lovable manners, has he ?" inquired Dopsy, with her childish air. " But he is so good hearted." " No doubt. You have known him some time, haven't you ?" inquired Angus, who had been struggling with an uncomfortable yearning to kick the Squire into the bay. The scene offered such temptations. They were standing on the edge of the amphitheatre, the ground shelving steeply downward in front of them, rocks and water below. And to think that she — his dearest — she, all gentleness and refinement, was mated to this coarse clay. Was King Mark such an one as this, he wondered, and if he were, who could be angry with Tristan — Tristan who died longing to see his lost love — struck to death by his wife's cruel lie — Tristan whose passionate soul passed by metempsychosis into briar and leaf, and crept across the arid rock to meet and mingle with the beloved dead. Oh, how sweet and sad the old legend seemed to Angus to day, standing above the melancholy sea, where he and she had stood folded in each other's arms in the sweet triumphant moment of love's first avowal. Dopsy did not allow him much leisure for mournful meditation. She prattled on in that sweetly girlish manner which was meant to be all spirit and sparkle, glancing from theme to theme, like the butterfly among the flowers, and showing a level ignorance on all. Mr. Hamleigh listened with Christian resignation, and even allowed himself to be her escort home, and to seem especially attentive to her at afternoon tea ; for although it may take two to make a quarrel, assuredly one, if she but brazen enough, may make a flirtation. Dopsy felt that time was short, and that strong measures were necessary. Mr. Hamleigh had been very polite — attentive even. Dopsy, accustomed to the free and easy manners of her brother's friends, mistook Mr. Hamleigh's natural courtesy to the sex for particular homage to the individual. But he had said nothing, and she was no nearer the assurance of becoming Mrs. Hamleigh than she had been on the evening of his arrival. Dopsy had been fain to confess this to Mopsy in the confidence of sisterly discourse. " It seems as if I might just as well have had a try for him myself, instead of standing out to give you a better chance," retorted Mopsy, somewhat scornfully. " Go in and win if you can," said Dopsy. " It won't be the first time you've tried to cut me out." Dopsy, embittered by the sense of failure, determined on new tactics. Hitherto she had been all sparkle ; now she melted into a touching sadness. " What a delicious old room this is," she murmured, glancing round at the bookshelves and dark panelling, the high wide chimney piece with its coat of arms, in heraldic colours, flashing and gleaming against a background of brown oak. " I cannot help feeling wretched at the idea that next week I shall be far away from this dear place — in dingy dreary London. Oh, Mr. Hamleigh," detaining him while she selected one particular piece of sugar from the basin he was handing her, " don't you detest London ?"" Not absolutely. I have sometimes found it endurable." " Ah, you have your clubs — just the one pleasantest street in all the great overgrown city — and that street lined with palaces, whose doors are always standing open for you. Libraries, smoking rooms, billiard tables, perfect dinners, and all that is freshest and brightest in the way of society. I don't wonder men like London. but for women it has only two attractions — Moody and the shop windows." "And the park, the theatres, the churches, the delight of looking at other women's gowns and bonnets. I thought that could never pall." "It does, though. There comes a time when one feels weary of everything," said Dopsy, pensively stirring her tea, and so fixing Mr. Hamleigh with her conversation that he was obliged to linger — yea, even to set down his own teacup on an adjacent table, and to seat himself by the charmer's side. " I thought you so delighted in the theatres," he said. " You were full of enthusiasm about the drama the night I first dined here." " Was I ?" demanded Dopsy naively. " And now I feel as if I did not care a straw about all the plays that were ever acted — all the actors who ever lived. Strange, is it not, that one can change so in one little fortnight ?"" The change is a hallucination. You are fascinated by the charms of a rural life, which you have not known long enough for satiety. You will be just as fond of plays and players when you get back to London." " Never !" exclaimed Dopsy. " It is not only my taste that is changed — it is myself. I feel as if I were a new creature." " What a blessing for yourself and society if the change were radical," said Mr. Hamleigh within himself; and then he answered lightly: " Perhaps you have been attending the little chapel at Boscastle, secretly imbibing the doctrines of advanced Methodism, and this is a spiritual awakening." " No," sighed Dopsy, shaking her head pensively as she gazed at her teacup. " It is an utter change. I cannot make it out. I don't think I shall ever care for gaiety, parties, theatres, dress, again." " Oh, this must be the influence of the Methodists." " I hate Methodists. I never spoke to one in my life. I should like to go into a convent. I should like to belong to a Protestant sisterhood, and to nurse the poor in their own houses. It would be nasty. I should catch some dreadful complaint and die, I daresay ; but it would be better than what I feel now." And Dopsy, taking advantage of the twilight, and the fact that she and Angus were at some distance from the rest of the party, burst into tears. They were very real tears — tears of vexation, disappointment, despair; and they made Angus very uncomfortable. " My dear Miss Vandeleur, I am so sorry to see you distressed. Is there anything on your mind ? Is there anything I can do ? Shall I fetch your sister ?"" No, no," gasped Dopsy, in a choked voice. " Please don't go away. I like you to be near me." She put out her hand — a chilly, tremulous hand, with no passion in it save the passionate pain of despair, and touched his, timidly, entreatingly, as if she were calling upon him for pity and help. She was, indeed, in her inmost heart, asking him to rescue her from the great dismal swamp of poverty and disrepute — to take her to himself and give her a place and status among well bred people, and make her life worth living. This was dreadful. Angus Hamleigh, in all the variety of his experience of womankind, had never before found himself face to face with this kind of difficulty. He had not been blind to Miss Vandeleur's strenuous endeavours to charm him. He had parried those light arrows lightly ; but he was painfully embarrassed by this appeal to his compassion. It was a new thing for him to sit beside a weeping woman, whom he could neither love nor admire, but from whom he could not withhold his pity. " I daresay her life is dismal enough," he thought, " with such a brother as Poker Vandeleur, and a father to match." While he sat in silent embarrassment, and while Dopsy slowly dried her tears with a gaudy little coloured handkerchief taken from a smart little breast pocket in the tailor gown, Mr. Tregonell sauntered across the room to the window where they sat, a Tudor window with a deep embrasure. " What are you two talking about in the dark ?" he asked, as Dopsy confusedly shuffled the handkerchief back into the breast pocket. " Something very sentimental, I should think, from the look of you. Poetry, I suppose." Dopsy said not a word. She believed that Leonard meant well by her — that if his influence could bring Mr. Hamleigh's nose to the grindstone, to the grindstone that nose would be brought. So she looked up at her brother's friend with a watery smile and remained mute. " We were talking about London and the theatres," answered Angus, " not a very sentimental topic," and then he got up and walked away with his teacup, to the table near which Christabel was sitting, in the flickering firelight, and seated himself by her side, and began to talk to her about a box of books that had arrived from London that day — books that were familiar to him and new to her. Leonard looked after him with a scowl, safe in the shadow ; while Dopsy, feeling that she had made a fool of herself, lapsed again into tears. "I am afraid he is behaving very badly to you," said Leonard. "Oh, no, no. But he has such strange ways. He blows hot and cold." "In plain words, he's a heartless flirt," answered Leonard impatiently. "He has been fooled by a pack of women — pretends to be dying of consumption — gives himself no end of airs. He has flirted outrageously with you. Has he proposed?" "No, not exactly," faltered Dopsy. "Someone ought to bring him to the scratch. Your brother must tackle him." "Don't you think if Jack were to say anything — were just to hint that I was being made very unhappy — that such marked attentions before all the world put me in a false position — don't you think it might do harm ?"" Quite the contrary. It would do good. No man ought to trifle with a girl's feelings in that way. No man shall be allowed to do it in my house. If Jack won't speak to him, I will." " Oh, Mr. Tregonell, what a noble heart you have — what a true friend you have always been to us." " You are my friend's sister — my wife's guest. I won't see you trifled with." " And you really think his attentions have been marked ?"" Very much marked. He shall not be permitted to amuse himself at your expense. There he sits, talking sentiment to my wife — just as he has talked sentiment to you. Why doesn't he keep on the safe side, and confine his attentions to married women ?"" You are not jealous of him ?" asked Dopsy, with some alarm. " Jealous ? I ? It would take a very extraordinary kind of wife, and a very extraordinary kind of admirer of that wife, to make me jealous." Dopsy felt her hopes in somewise revived by Mr. TregonelFs manner of looking at things. Up to this point she had mistrusted exceedingly that the flirting was all on her side ; but now Leonard most distinctly averred that Angus Hamleigh had flirted, and in a manner obvious to every one. And if Mr. Hamleigh really admired her — if he were really blowing hot and cold — inclining one day to make her his wife, and on another day disposed to let her languish and fade in South Belgravia — might not a word or two from a judicious friend turn the scale, and make her happy for life ? She went up to her room to dress in a flutter of hope and fear — so agitated that she could scarcely manage the more delicate details of her toilet — the drapery of her skirt, the adjustment of the sunflower on her shoulder. " How flushed and shaky you are !" exclaimed Mopsy, pausing in the pencilling of an eyebrow to look at her sister. " Is the deed done ? Has he popped ?"" No, he has not popped ; but I think he will." " I wish I were of your opinion. I should like a rich sister. It would be the next best thing to being well off oneself." " You only think of his money," said Dopsy, who had really fallen in love — for only about the 15th time, so there was still freshness in the feeling. " I should care for him just as much if he were a pauper." " No, you would not," said Mopsy. " I daresay you think you would, but you wouldn't. There is a glamour about money which nobody in our circumstances can resist. A man who dresses perfectly, who has never been hard up, who has always lived among elegant people — there is a style about him that goes straight to one's heart. Don't you remember how in ' Peter Wilkins ' there are different orders of beings — a superior class, born so, bred so, always apart and above the others ? Mr. Hamleigh belongs to that higher order. If he were poor and shabby he would be a different person. You wouldn't care twopence for him." The Rector of Trevalga and his wife dined at Mount Royal that evening, so Dopsy fell to the lot of Mr. Hamleigh, and had plenty of opportunity of carrying on the siege during dinner, while Mrs. Tregonell and the Rector, who was an enthusiastic antiquarian, talked of the latest discoveries in Druidic remains. After dinner came the usual adjournment to billiards. The Rector and his wife stayed in the drawing room with Christabel and Jessie. Mr. Hamleigh would have remained with them, but Leonard specially invited him to the billiard room. " You must have had enough Mendelssohn and Beethoven to last you for the next 6 months," he said. " You had better come and have a smoke with us." " I could never have too much good music," answered Angus. " Well, I don't suppose you'd get much to night. The Rector and my wife will talk about pots and pans all the evening, now they've once started. You may as well be sociable, for once in a way, and come with us." Such an invitation, given in heartiest tones and with seeming frankness, could hardly be refused. So Angus went across the hall with the rest of the billiard players to the fine old room, once a chapel, in which there was space enough for settees and easy chairs, tea tables, books, flowers and dogs, without the slightest inconvenience to the players. " You'll play, Hamleigh ?" said Leonard. " No, thanks. I'd rather sit and smoke and watch you." "Really? Then Monty and I will play Jack and one of the girls. Billiards is the only game at which one can afford to play against relations. They can't cheat. Mopsy, will you play? Dopsy can mark." "What a thorough good fellow he is," thought Dopsy, charmed with an arrangement which left her comparatively free for flirtation with Mr. Hamleigh, who had taken possession of Christabel's favourite seat — a low capacious basket chair by the wide wood fire, and had Christabel's table near him loaded with her books and work basket — those books which were all his favourites as well as hers, and which made an indissoluble link between them. What is mere blood relationship compared with the subtler tie of mutual likings and dislikings? The men all lighted their cigarettes, and the game progressed with tolerably equal fortunes, Jack Vandeleur playing well enough to make amends for any lack of skill on the part of Mopsy, whose want of the scientific purpose and certainty which come from long experience, was as striking as her dashing and self assured method of handling her cue, and her free use of all slang terms peculiar to the game. Dopsy oscillated between the marking board and the fireplace, sometimes kneeling on the Persian rug to play with Randie and the other dogs, sometimes standing in a pensive attitude by the chimney piece, talking to Angus. All traces of tears were gone. Her cheeks were flushed, her eyes brightened by an artful touch of Indian ink under the lashes, her eyebrows accentuated by the same artistic treatment, her large fan held with the true Grosvenor Gallery air. " Do you believe that peacocks' feathers are unlucky?" she asked, looking pensively at the fringe of green and azure plumage on her fan. " I am not altogether free from superstition, but my idea of the Fates has never taken that particular form. Why should the peacock be a bird of evil omen ? I can believe anything bad of the screech owl or the raven, but the harmless ornamental peacock — surely he is innocent of our woes." " I have known the most direful calamities follow the introduction of peacocks' feathers into a drawing room. Yet they are so tempting, one can hardly live without them." " Really ? Do you know that I have found existence endurable without so much as a tuft of down from that unmelodious bird ?"" Have you never longed for its plumage to give life and colour to your rooms ? Such exquisite colour, such delicious harmony. I wonder that you, who have such artistic taste, can resist the fascination." " I hope you have not found that pretty fan the cause of many woes," said Mr. Hamleigh smilingly, as the damsel posed herself in the early Italian manner, and slowly waved the bright hued plumage. " I cannot say that I have been altogether happy since I possessed it," answered Dopsy, with a shy downward glance and a smothered sigh. " And yet I don't know. I have been only too happy sometimes, perhaps, and at other times deeply wretched." " Is not that kind of variableness common to our poor human nature, independent of peacocks' feathers ?"" Not to me. I used to be the most thoughtless happy go lucky creature." " Until when ?"" Till I came to Cornwall," with a faint sigh, and a sudden upward glance of a pair of blue eyes which would have been pretty had they been only innocent of all scheming. " Then I'm afraid this mixture of sea and mountain air does not agree with you. Too exciting for your nerves, perhaps." " I don't think it is that," with a still fainter sigh. " Then the peacock's feathers must be to blame. Why don't you throw your fan into the fire ?"" Not for worlds," said Dopsy. " Why not ?"" First, because it cost a guinea," naively, " and then because it is associated with quite the happiest period of my life." " You said just now you had been unhappy since you owned it." " Only by fits and starts. Too utterly happy at other times." " If I say another word she will dissolve into tears again," thought Angus. " I shall have to leave Mount Royal. A man in weak health is no match for a young woman of this type. She will get me into a corner and declare I have proposed to her." He got up and went over to the table where Mr. Montagu was just finishing the game, with a break which had left Dopsy free for flirtation during the last 10 minutes. Mr. Hamleigh played in the next game, but this hardly bettered his condition, for Dopsy now took her sister's place with the cue, and required to be instructed as to every stroke, and even to have her fingers placed in position, now and then by Angus, when the ball was under the cushion and the stroke in any way difficult. This lengthened the game, and bored Angus exceedingly, besides making him ridiculous in the eyes of the other 3 men. " I hate playing with lovers," muttered Leonard, under his breath, when Dopsy was especially worrying about the exact point at which she was to hit the ball for a particular cannon. " Decidedly I must get away to morrow," reflected Angus. The game went on merrily enough, and was only just over when the stable clock struck 11, at which hour the servants brought in a tray with a tankard of mulled claret for vice, and a syphon for virtue. The Miss Vandeleurs, after pretending to say good night, were persuaded to sip a little of the hot spiced wine, and were half inclined to accept the cigarettes persuasively offered by Mr. Montagu; till, warned by a wink from Jack, they drew up suddenly, declared they had been quite too awfully dissipated, that they should be too late to wish Mrs. Tregonell good night, and skipped away. " Awfully jolly girls, those sisters of yours," said Montagu, as he closed the door which he had opened for the damsel's exit, and strolled back to the hearth, where Angus was sitting dreamily caressing Randie, her dog. How many a happy dog has received caresses charged with the love of his mistress, such mournful kisses as Dido lavished on the young Ascanius in the dead watches of the weary night. Jack Vandeleur and his host had begun another game, delighted at having the table to themselves. "Yes, they're nice girls," answered Mr. Vandeleur, without looking off the table, " just the right kind of girls for a country house, no starch, no prudishness, but as innocent as babies, and as true hearted — well, they are all heart. I should be sorry to see anybody trifle with either of them. It would be a very serious thing for her, and it should be my business to make it serious for him." " Great advantage for a girl to have a brother who enjoys the reputation of being a dead shot," said Mr. Montagu, " or it would be if duelling were not an exploded institution — like a trial for witchcraft, and hanging for petty larceny." " Duelling is never out of fashion among gentlemen," answered Jack, making a cannon and going in off the red. " That makes 17, Monty. There are injuries which nothing but the pistol can redress, and I'm not sorry that my Red River experience has made me a pretty good shot. But I'm not half as good as Leonard. He could give me 50 in 100 any day." " When a man has to keep his party in butcher's meat by the use of his rifle, he'd need be a decent marksman," answered Mr. Tregonell, carelessly. " I never knew the right use of a gun till I crossed the Rockies. By the way, who is for woodcock shooting to morrow ? You'll come, I suppose, Jack ?"" Not to morrow, thanks. Monty and I are going over to Bodmin to see a man hanged. We've got an order to view, as the house agents call it. Monty is supposed to be on the Times. I go for the Western Daily Mercury." " What a horrid ghoulish thing to do," said Leonard. " It's seeing life," answered Jack, shrugging his shoulders. " I should call it the other thing. However, as crime is very rare in Cornwall, you may as well make the most of your opportunity. But it's a pity to neglect the birds. This is one of the best seasons we've had since 1860, when there was a remarkable flight of birds in the second week in October. But even that year wasn't as good as '55, when a farmer at St. Buryan killed close upon 60 birds in a week. You'll go to morrow, I hope, Mr. Hamleigh. There's some very good ground about St. Nectan^s Kieve, and it's a picturesque sort of place that will just hit your fancy." " I have been to the Kieve often. Yes, it is a lovely spot," answered Angus, remembering his first visit to Mount Royal, and the golden afternoons which he had spent with Christabel among the rocks and the ferns, their low voices half drowned by the noise of the waterfall. " But I shan't be able to shoot to morrow. I have just been making up my mind to tear myself away from Mount Royal, and I was going to ask you to let one of your grooms drive me over to Launceston in time for the midday train. I can get up from Plymouth by the limited mail." " Why are you in such a hurry ?" asked Leonard. " I thought you were rather enjoying yourself with us." " So much so that as far as my own inclination goes there is no reason why I should not stay here for the rest of my life — only you would get tired of me — and I have promised my doctor to go southward before the frosty weather begins. A day or two can't make much difference." " Not much. Only when there is a disagreeable effort to be made the sooner one gets it over the better." " I'm sorry you're off so suddenly," said Leonard, going on with the game, and looking rather oddly across the table at Captain Vandeleur. " I am more than sorry," said that gentleman. " I am surprised. But perhaps I am not altogether in the secret of your movements." " There is no secret," said Angus. " Isn't there ? Then I'm considerably mistaken. It has looked very much lately as if there were a particular understanding between you and my elder sister ; and I think, as her brother, I have some right to be let into the secret before you leave Mount Royal." " I am sorry that either my manner or Miss Vandeleur's should have so far misled you," answered Angus with freezing gravity. He pitied the sister, but felt only cold contempt for the brother. The young lady and I have never interchanged a word which might not have been heard by everybody at Mount Royal." "And you have no serious intentions? You have never pretended to any serious feeling about her?" "Never. Charming as the young lady may be, I have been, and am, adamant against all such fascinations. A man who has been told that he may not live a year is hardly in a position to make an offer of marriage. Good night, Tregonell. I shall rely on your letting one of your men drive me to the station." He nodded good night to the other two men, and left the room. Randie, who loved him for the sake of old times, followed at his heels. "There goes a cur who deserves a dose of cold lead," said Jack, looking vindictively towards the door. "What, Randie, my wife's favourite?" "No, the two-legged cur. Come, you two men know how outrageously that puppy has flirted with my sister." "I know there has been some kind of flirtation," answered Mr. Montagu, luxuriously buried in a large armchair, with his legs hanging over the arm, "and I suppose it's the man who's to blame. Of course it always is the man." "Did you ever hear such a sneaking evasion?" demanded Back. "Not a year to live, forsooth! Why, if he can't make her his wife he is bound as a gentleman to make her his widow." "He has plenty of coin, hasn't he?" asked Montagu. "Your sister has never gone for me, and I'm dreadfully soft under such treatment. When I think of the number of girls I've proposed to, and how gracefully I've always backed out of it afterwards, I really wonder at my own audacity. I never refused to marry the lady. Pas si bête. I adore you, and will be married to morrow if you like, I say. But you'll have to live with your papa and mamma for the first 10 years. Perhaps by that time I might be able to take second floor lodgings in Bloomsbury, and we could begin housekeeping." "You're a privileged pauper," said Captain Vandeleur. "Mr. Hamleigh is quite another kind of individual, and I say that he has behaved in a dastardly manner to my elder sister. Everybody in this house thought that he was in love with her." "You have told us so several times," answered Montagu coolly, "and we're bound to believe you, don't you know." "I should have thought you'd have had too much spunk to see an old friend's sister jilted in such a barefaced way, Tregonell," said Jack Vandeleur, who had drunk just enough to make him quarrelsome. "You don't mean to say that I'm accountable for his actions, do you?" retorted Leonard. "That's rather a large order." "I mean to say that you asked him here, and you puffed him off as a great catch, and half turned poor little Dop's head by your talk about him. If you knew what an arrant flirt he was you oughtn't to have brought him inside your doors." "Perhaps I didn't know anything about it," answered Leonard, with his most exasperating air. "Then I can only say that if half I've heard is true you ought to have known all about it." "As how?" "Because it's common club talk that he flirted with your wife, was engaged to her, and was thrown off by her on account of his extremely disreputable antecedents. Your mother has the sole credit of the throwing off, by the by." "You had better leave my mother's name and my wife's name out of your conversation." "That's 28 to me, Monty. Poker has spoiled a capital break by his d personality." "I beg your pardon. Mrs. Tregonell is simply perfect, and there is no woman I more deeply honour. But still you must allow me to wonder that you ever let that man cross your threshold." "You are welcome to go on wondering. It's a wholesome exercise for a sluggish brain." "Game!" exclaimed Mr. Montagu, and Leonard put his cue in the rack, and walked away, without another word to either of his guests. "He's a dreadful bear," said little Monty, emptying the tankard. "But you oughtn't to have talked about his wife, Poker. That was bad form." "Does he ever study good form when he talks of my people? He had no business to bring that fine gentleman here to flirt with my sister." "But really now, don't you think your sister did her share of the flirting, and that she's rather an old hand at that kind of thing? I adore Dop and Mop, as I'm sure you know, and I only wish I were rich enough to back my opinion by marrying one of them; but I don't think our dear little Dopsy is the kind of girl to break her heart about any man — more especially a sentimental duffer with hollow cheeks and a hollow cough. Just the kind of man to interest a warm-hearted girl. No more claret. Well, I suppose we may as well go to roost." Chapter 12 of Mount Royal, Volume 2, by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. This LibriVox is in the public domain. Chapter 12. And time is setting wi' me, oh. Angus Hamleigh left the billiard players with the intention of going straight to his own room. But in the hall he encountered the rector of Trevalga, who was just going away, very apologetic at having stayed so late, beguiled by the fascination of antiquarian talk. Christabel and Jessie had come out to the hall to bid their old friends good night, and thus it happened that Mr. Hamleigh went back to the drawing room and sat there talking till nearly midnight. They sat in front of the dying fire, talking as they had talked in days gone by, and their conversation grew sad and solemn as the hour wore on. Angus announced his intended departure, and Christabel had no word to say against his decision. " We shall be very sorry to lose you," she said, sheltering her personality behind the plural pronoun, " but I think it is wise of you to waste no more time." " I have not wasted an hour. It has been unspeakable happiness for me to be here ; and I am more grateful than I can say to your husband for having brought me here — for having treated me with such frank cordiality. The time has come when I may speak very freely — yes, a man whose race is so nearly run need have no reserves of thought or feeling. I think, Mrs. Tregonell, that you and Miss Bridgeman, who knows me almost as well as you do "" Better, perhaps," murmured Jessie in a scarcely audible voice. " Must both know that my life for the last 4 years has been one long regret — that all my days and hours have been steeped in the bitterness of remorse. I am not going now to dispute the justice of the sentence which spoiled my life and broke my heart. I submitted without question, because I knew that the decree was wise. I had no right to offer you the ruin of a life "" Do not speak of that," cried Christabel, with a stifled sob. " For pity's sake don't speak of the past. I cannot bear it." " Then I will not say another word — except to tell you that your goodness to me in these latter days — your friendship — so frankly, so freely given — has steeped my soul in peace — has filled my mind with sweet memories which will soothe my hours of decline, when I am far from this dear house where I was once so happy. I wish I could leave some pleasant memory here when I am gone. I wish your boy had been old enough to remember me in the days to come, as one who loved him better than any one on earth could love him, after his father and mother." Christabel answered no word. She sat with her hand before her eyes, tears streaming slowly down her cheeks — tears that were happily invisible in the faint light of the shaded lamps and the fading fire. And then they went on to talk of life in the abstract, its difficulties, its problems, its consolations — and of death, and the dim world beyond — the unknown land of universal recompense, where the deep joys striven after here, and never attained, are to be ours in a purer, more spiritual form — where love shall no longer walk hand in hand with pain and sorrow, dogged by the dark spectre of death. Illness and solitude had done much to exalt and spiritualize Angus Hamleigh's mind. The religion of dogma, the strict hard and fast creed which was the breath of life to Leonard's mother, had never been grappled with or accepted by him, but it was in his nature to be religious. Never, at his worst, had he sheltered his errors under the brazen front of paganism. Never had he denied the beauty of a pure and perfect life, a simple childlike faith, heroic, self-abnegating love of God and man. He had admired and honoured such virtue in others, and had been sorry that nature had cast him in a lower mould. Then had come the sentence which told him that his days here were to be of the fewest, and without conscious effort his thoughts had taken a more serious cast. The great problem had come nearer home to him, and he had found its only solution to be hope — hope more or less vague and dim — more or less secure and steadfast, according to the temperament of the thinker. All metaphysical argument for or against — all theological teaching could push the thing no further. It seemed to him that it was the universal instinct of mankind to desire and hope for an imperishable life, purer, better, fairer than the life we know here — and that innate in every human breast there dwells capacity for immortality, and disbelief in extinction; and to this universal instinct he surrendered himself unreservedly, content to demand no stronger argument than that grand chapter of Corinthians which has consoled so many generations of mourners. So now, speaking with these two women of the life to come — the fair, sweet, all satisfying life after death — he breathed no word which the most orthodox churchman might not have approved. He spoke in the fulness of a faith which, based on instinct and not on dogma, had ripened with the decline of all delight and interest in this lower life. He spoke as a man for whom earth's last moorings had been loosened, whose only hopes pointed skyward. It was while he was talking thus, with an almost passionate earnestness, and yet wholly free from all earthly passion, that Mr. Tregonell entered the room and stood by the door, contemplating the group by the hearth. The spectacle was not pleasant to a man of intensely jealous temperament, a man who had been testing and proving the wife whom he could not completely trust, whom he loved grudgingly, with a savage, half angry love. Christabel's face, dimly lighted by the lamp on the low table near her, was turned towards the speaker, the lips parted, the large blue eyes bright with emotion. Her hands were clasped upon the elbow of the chair, and her attitude was one of who listens to words of deepest, dearest meaning; while Angus Hamleigh sat a little way off with his eyes upon her face, his whole air and expression charged with feeling. To Leonard's mind all such earnestness, all sentiment of any kind, came under one category — it all meant love making, more or less audacious, more or less hypocritical, dressed in modern phraseology, sophisticated, disguised, super-refined, fantastical, called one day aestheticism and peacock's feathers, another day positivism, agnosticism, Swinburne-cum-Burne-Jonesism, but always the same thing au fond, and meaning war to domestic peace. There sat Jessie Bridgeman, the dragon of prudery placed within call, but was any woman safer for the presence of a duenna? Was it not in the nature of such people to look on simperingly while the poisoned cup was being quaffed, and to declare afterwards that they had supposed the mixture perfectly harmless? No doubt Tristan and Iseult had somebody standing by to play propriety when they drank from the fatal goblet, and bound themselves for life in the meshes of an unhappy love. No, the mere fact of Miss Bridgeman's presence was no pledge of safety. There was no guilt in Mrs. TregonelFs countenance, assuredly, when she looked up and saw her husband standing near the door, watchful, silent, with a preoccupied air that was strange to him. " What is the matter, Leonard ?" she asked, for his manner implied that something was amiss. " Nothing. I was wondering to find you up so late, that's all." " The Rector and his wife stayed till 11, and we have been sitting here talking. Mr. Hamleigh means to leave us to morrow." " Yes, I know," answered Leonard curtly. " Oh, by the way," turning to Angus, " there is something I want to say to you before you go to bed — something about your journey to morrow." " I am quite at your service." Instead of approaching the group by the fireplace, Leonard turned and left the room, leaving Mr. Hamleigh under the necessity of following him. " Good night," he said, shaking hands with Christabel. " I shall not say good bye till to morrow. I suppose I shall not have to leave Mount Royal till 11 o'clock." " I think not." " Good night, Miss Bridgeman. I shall never forget how kind you have been to me." She looked at him earnestly, but made no reply, and in the next instant he was gone. " What can have happened ?" asked Christabel anxiously. " I am sure there is something wrong. Leonard's manner was so strange." " Perhaps he and his dear friends have been quarrelling," Jessie answered carelessly. " I believe Captain Vandeleur breaks out into vindictive language sometimes, after he has taken a little too much wine. Mop told me as much in her amiable candour ; and I know the Captain's glass was filled very often at dinner, for I had the honour of sitting next to him." " I hope there is nothing really wrong," said Christabel, but she could not get rid of the sense of uneasiness to which Leonard's strange manner had given rise. She went to her boy's nursery, as she did every night, before going to bed, and said her prayers beside his pillow. She had begun this one night when the child was ill, and had never missed a night since. The quiet recess in which the little one's cot stood was her oratory. Here in the silence, broken only by the ticking of the clock or the fall of a cinder on the hearth, while the nurse slept near at hand, the mother prayed ; and her prayers seemed to her sweeter and more efficacious here than in any other place. So soon as those childish lips could speak it would be her delight to teach her son to pray ; and in the meantime her supplications went up to Heaven for him, from a heart that overflowed with motherly love. There had been one dismal interval of her life when she had loved no one — having really no one to love — secretly loathing her husband — not daring even to remember that other, once so fondly loved — and then, when her desolate heart seemed walled round with an icy barrier that divided it from all human feeling, God had given her this child — and lo ! the ice had melted, and her reawakened soul had kindled and glowed with warmth and gladness. It was not in Christabel's nature to love many things, or many people. Rather was it natural to her to love one person intensely, as she had loved her adopted mother in her girlhood, as she had loved Angus Hamleigh in the bloom of her womanhood, as she loved her boy now. She was leaving the child's room after prayers and meditations that had been somewhat longer than usual, when she heard voices, and saw Mr. Tregonell and Mr. Hamleigh by the door of the room occupied by the latter, which was at the further end of the gallery. " You understand my plan ?" said Leonard. " Perfectly." " It prevents all trouble, don't you see ?"" Yes, I believe it may," answered Angus, and without any word of good night he opened his door and went into his room, while Leonard turned on his heel and strolled to his own quarters. " Was there anything amiss between you and Mr. Hamleigh that you parted so coldly just now ?" asked Christabel presently, when her husband came from his dressing room into the bedroom where she sat musing by the fire. " What, aren't you gone to bed yet ?" he exclaimed. " You seem to be possessed by a wakeful demon to night." " I have been in the boy's room. Was there anything amiss, Leonard ?"" You are monstrously anxious about it. No. What should there be amiss ? You didn't expect to see us hugging each other like a couple of Frenchmen, did you ?" End of Project Gutenberg's Mount Royal Vol. 2 by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Recorded by Céline Major.